on our YouTube channel, but it's only those people who are unmuted and appearing in the little yellow box who get to appear in the internet in a bit. Also, if you have any questions for our author tonight, please type them up in the chat. I'll keep those and we'll then pose them during the Q&A at the end. The chat is also where I'm about to put a link where you can purchase tonight's book from Northshire, right there. Now, as we get started, it is my great pleasure to introduce Sara Kamali, author of the new book, Homegrown Hate: Why White Nationalists and Militant Islamists are Waging War Against the United States.
Oh, I'm so happy to be here with you, David. Today. Yeah.
Oh, no, I wasn't done yet. I just got distracted by admitting someone. Normally my co-host is here to hit all the buttons while I'm reading an introduction. So well, let me continue. I say nice things. Okay. Sara is a senior fellow at the Center for Analysis of the Radical Right. As a holistic justice activist and a scholar of systemic inequities, white nationalism, and militant Islamism, her work addresses how interlocking institutions of power oppress the many while maintaining systems of privilege for a select few. Reviewers have called Homegrown Hate eerily prescient, an extraordinary and courageous work, and that Sara's poetic voice is profound and prophetic. We are lucky to be joined also by Todd Green for this event. He is an associate professor of religion and the director for the Center for Ethics and Public Engagement at Luther College in Iowa. He is also a former advisor on Islamophobia in Europe at the US State Department in Washington. He's the author of 2 books on Islamophobia, The Fear of Islam and Presumed Guilty. Please join me in welcoming to Northshire, Todd Green and Sara Kamali. Okay, now you can go.
Thank you, David. And I want to thank Rachel, who sadly could not be here this evening. I'm delighted to be here virtually at Northshire Books. And I'm also looking forward to speaking with Todd. And I would also like to thank everybody who's taken the time to join us this evening. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me as well. And I look forward to the conversation with Sara about this brand new book that I think is really groundbreaking and really brings together 2 important topics that she and I were talking about this yesterday. Are actually not often linked together in a lot of political and public discourse in the United States. And, you know, an interesting conversation we can have and maybe follow up with the audience with as well is why that is, you know, aside from the fact that I haven't read her book yet, but hopefully that will change, right? So I'm happy to be in this position of sort of you know, facilitating a conversation here initially with Sara about her book, and if I can, I'll just go ahead and start along those lines. I know that, you know, there are a lot of media pundits, Sara, a lot of politicians that would not readily see a connection between white nationalists and militant Islamists, and yet you set out to write a book that seeks to tie these 2 groups together. Can you tell us a little bit about what is the common denominator between these 2 groups within the United States? What do most people not understand about the common forces that drive both white nationalists and militant Islamists?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. And I'm hoping we can delve into that from the perception of the audience later on. But as I argue in the book, and I make the case quite clearly in the book, is that essentially the parallels can be seen with both the self-perpetuated narratives of victimhood, as well as a demonization of the other that essentially justifies the use of violence. So both white nationalists and militant Islamists in the United States and transnationally, so around the world, harness this sense of victimhood in order to sanction violence against whomever is deemed the other. And it's really interesting in terms of the different components in which they do that, either through religion and or political beliefs. And the sense of victimhood is also propped up by domestic politics as well as international politics. And when I say domestic politics, I mean within the US and also in other states. So for example, with white nationalism specifically, there's a sense of victimhood that white identity is being attacked. So not that white identity is on the offensive, but the white identity and white culture is being attacked by the rise of people of color generally, as well as different domestic policies that are used to suppress white culture, such as what we have with gun control that President Biden just spoke on today. And then as far as as far as militant Islamism, there's a sense of victimhood that's very much buttressed by an interpretation of American foreign policy, as well as the foreign policy of many European and Australasian countries that are essentially perceived as targeting and attacking specific type of Islam by virtue of wars in Muslim majority nations. So it's also interesting, the dynamic with militant Islamism, because many militant Islamists don't necessarily see their fellow citizens within America, for example, or within Northern Western European countries, for example, as being fellow Muslims, but rather they are viewed as apostates, and they themselves are viewed as the righteous, sincere Muslims. So we can talk about that too. But yeah, sense of victimhood and an otherization that essentially sanctions violence.
No, thank you. That's a great overview of your book. I noticed in reading your book, you have pretty strong views on the use of the word jihad, which is kind of, particularly since 9/11 in the United States, has been ubiquitously used by the media and many politicians. But I sense in the book that you see that as kind of a major problem. So can you say a little bit more about why it's inappropriate to use the word jihad in the context of describing the violence carried out by militant Islamists, and why you prefer to refer to them as militant Islamists as opposed to jihadis?
Mm-hmm. So the usage of the term jihad to mean holy war is actually a misnomer. And extrapolated from that, the use of jihadi to talk about someone who perpetuates war in the name of Islam is also a misnomer. So there's actually not the concept of jihad in terms of physical violence from an Islamic Orthodox perspective. Rather, even the Quran, which is the holy text for the billions of Muslims around the world, uses a different term called qital. And so in using a different term, militant Islamist, I'm actually very specific. That term specifies the politicization of a certain agenda by Islamism. So Islamism is actually quite a generic term, but then putting the qualifier militant on it signifies that there's both violence as well as a political agenda, which is essentially what these types of terrorists aim to do, is use violence in the pursuit of a political agenda, and moving away from terms like jihad, which are not only religious misnomers, but also we need to move away from the fact that religion itself is the cause of violence, rather than perhaps being exploited by certain actors to legitimate violence. And so there's a big difference between that. And the term Qitali, for example, wouldn't necessarily work either. I wanted some English term. There's enough italicized terms in the book, I think, for most readers. But I'm curious to know, Todd, how do you perceive the term? How do you perceive the terms jihad and jihadi in your own line of work?
No, I actually appreciate your hesitation about the use of those words, in part because broader populations in the United States and many so-called Western countries, I think, struggle with understanding of the relationship between religion and violence. The assumption very quickly, for example, with people with a Muslim background who commit violence or what gets labeled as terrorism, is that they open up a book called the Quran, they read a few passages, they close it, and they go off and they do something really horrible. And therefore, using something that's found within Islam to sort of describe that kind of violence, right? It kind of narrows this notion of something of religion that gets extricated from larger cultural, political, social contexts and circumstances. As a religion scholar, most religious scholars look at that and are like, no, that's not how it works, right? What we must always kind of pay attention to is, why do such a small minority of people actually who have a Muslim background actually do this, and the majority of Muslims do not, right? A lot of people over 1 billion people read the Quran or listen to the Quran recited, right? Most of them don't go off and engage in terrorist attacks, including here in the United States. So what explains the difference? How does Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi of ISIS and Malala Yousafzai, a Nobel Peace Prize winner, read the same book and lead radically different lives? That's the kind of question we should be wrestling with, and then just simply limiting it to this word jihadi sort of encourages audiences to think, well, this is something about religion only, as extricated from political, social, cultural, historical context. And so, yeah, I share with you this skepticism of readily using that word, as opposed to maybe some language that tries to signal to a broader audience that this is complicated and there are other forces at work here that shape the religious worldviews or identities of the people involved.
And that tension between the interpretations of the text and then how texts are essentially wielded in the pursuit of political aims is something that I detail within the introduction and make very clear. And it's interesting you use that example between Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the now deceased head of Islamic State or Daesh, and Malala Yousafzai, because that same type of reading or misreading of scripture is actually found within white nationalism as well. And so there are many different types of white nationalists, as I describe. Maybe we can jump into that, I guess.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think, yeah, it's back to the how people within one religious tradition, and Christianity is not exempt from this at all, right?
Yeah.
Can read the same sacred text and have radically different interpretations and live it out in radically different ways.
Yes, and they wouldn't necessarily even call themselves Christian. They call themselves Christian identity adherents, for example, or specifically white evangelicals. So the way that I categorize white nationalism, which of course is becoming part of the vernacular, and yet there is still some ambiguity in terms of definitions, and like many things, they're used in different ways. But white nationalists are people who would seek a white ethno-state, and not necessarily in the United States, but in any nation around the world that is seen as meant to be either, divinely or politically or both, meant to be for white people. And whether that means that anybody who is considered non-white will either be exterminated or subjugated, that's left up to interpretation, but essentially a white ethno-state. And we find that in North America, we find that in Western and Northern Europe primarily, as well as Australasia. So the categories of white nationalism, and I'm sure this will become important in our conversation today, is we have anti-government, then we have just racist, and then religiously racist, along the lines of militant Mormonism, for example, or Latter-day Saints, along the lines of white nationalist evangelicalism, along the lines of Christian identity, along the lines of militant Odinism and Wotanism, creativity. There is a whole spectrum of actually religiously racist theologies that support white supremacy within white nationalism. And then the fourth category are conspiracy theorists, such as QAnon. And then there's an amalgamation of all four. So we can see these dynamics come into play over the centuries, if not decades, of white nationalism in this country, as well as in many others around the world.
Oh, no, thank you for that. This is helping us do a deeper dive into your book. I appreciate it. I am, as you are putting, these two topics together, white nationalist and militant Islamist, right? The framework that would often be used, or particularly for militant Islamists, but you're also arguing with white nationalists, is terrorism. It's a word we hear a lot. It's used in discourse a lot. It's been recycled quite a bit in the news recently with the Atlanta shootings, among others, right? The shooting in Colorado. The word terrorism, I've had this conversation before. The word terrorism is often a loaded word. One would argue, I would argue, it's often applied almost exclusively, at least in popular discourse, to individuals and organizations with a real or a perceived Muslim identity who carry out acts of violence targeting Muslims. So some scholars say maybe this word can't be salvaged. It's become too racialized. It's become too much focused on people with a Muslim background or people who are not white. But I was kind of curious about your position in this debate. Can the word terrorism be redeemed and salvaged in any meaningful way so that it no longer is racialized and intertwined with Islamophobic assumptions, but we can genuinely include white nationalists in this category? Or do we need different vocabulary?
Well, if we use it to apply to white nationalists, then it will be redeemed and salvaged. And that's something that I argue in the book, and that's why I use the word terrorism. I discuss why, of course, at length, pointing to many of the threads you just mentioned right now. But it's important to reclaim a lot of this language, precisely because terrorism has become so intertwined, if not synonymous, with millions of Muslims in the United States, as well as billions of Muslims around the world who are not in fact violent, nor are they even prone to violence as kind of the current terrorism tropes would have us believe. So there's always this this underlying current of perhaps the good Muslim versus bad Muslim trope. There's perhaps an underlying kernel of violence that would need a certain catalyst in order for a Muslim specifically to become violent. But we know from history, as well as I hope common sense, that that's not the case at all. That's not true. So I use the word terrorism very deliberately within my book in order to reclaim it, because we are going to, as January 6th has taught us, we are going to need to address white nationalism fully, and we need to call it what it is, and we're not going to be able to address the dynamics of white nationalism until we recognize it for what it is, which is essentially violence in the pursuit of political aims, which is terrorism.
Do you have some sense of hope, that maybe things are changing in terms of a broader application of this concept of terrorism? That, for example, the January 6th attacks on the Capitol and the way the media covered that, did you sense a shift in the media discourse in terms of actually being serious about applying the language of terrorism, what I call the T word, the language of terrorism, to what happened? And you think that will stick?
Yeah, it's so interesting you bring up media discourse specifically. I suppose this whole conversation can be around media discourse and terminology. But, well, if we look at the initial coverage of January 6th specifically, it was mob or group of people or somewhat more milquetoast. And then by the time we moved to Biden's inaugural speech, he specifically addressed terrorism in the context of what he called white supremacy. And now, with several members of his cabinet, including the Department of Homeland Security, Alejandro Mayorkas, now we have a fully robust conversation on white nationalist terrorism. So I would hope that type of discourse moves more towards the public sphere as well and shapes our current understanding of what terrorism is. And alongside that too, I often think about, well, it just seems perhaps that we moved on post 9/11 to the post 1/6 paradigm. And we really have to consider, though, that we really do need to break down the understanding and dismantle, I think, the idea that Muslim Americans and Muslims around the world are also involved with terrorism. Whereas I don't think we can fully address white nationalist terrorism until we also understand the dynamics and dismantle the linkages between many Muslims around the world and terrorism as well. So there has to be a dual program going on there in order for us to fully address it, which I discuss in the book.
No, thank you for that. Sara, what do you think explains the Islamophobia that drives much of the current counterterrorism paradigm? You discuss this quite a bit in the book. What does the U.S. government gain, for example, by focusing most of its counterterrorism efforts on individuals and organizations with a Muslim background, as opposed to what half your book is about, right? White nationalists and other linked groups.
It's essentially two books in one, I think. What do agencies essentially have to gain by propagating Islamophobia? I think as a justification of their funds and how they're spending it, honestly, it's going to be very difficult, as we've seen, with even with the tragedy in Atlanta, for example. We cannot even classify that as a hate crime as a nation. There's not necessarily a specific, a common way of addressing that, or a common way of perceiving the attacks on majority Asian American and specifically women, and understanding that as hate crime, let alone terrorism. So a lot of the current security agencies at the federal level, as well as all the way down to the local level, were developed in the post 9/11 paradigm. But I certainly do not think that they're going to be equipped currently or for the near future to deal with the post January 6th reality that we face. And how will you answer your question, Todd?
Yeah, no, I think about this quite a bit, so it's great to have a good conversation partner about it. But you know, both as a scholar and as someone who spent just a little bit of time with the State Department and kind of in the government circles, you know, it's clear that counterterrorism initiatives have a lot of funding. There's a lot of money involved, and in Washington, you should never you know, take that lightly. You know, there's a lot of financial resources to tap into, to mobilize. If you can link something to a version of a counterterrorism project that's going to generate a lot of you know, interest across the political spectrum, and targeting Muslim populations does that in a way that targeting white populations doesn't. But let's, you know, be blunt about it. There's a racism at work here. This is a more controversial or more provocative point to make, I suppose, and we can flesh this out in the conversation with the audience later. But I believe Islamophobia is fundamentally racism. Even though Muslims are not a race, but Muslims are racialized. They're treated as a race, conceived of as a race, imagined as a monolithic collective entity against whom all sorts of stereotypes can be projected, and Muslims are then treated as collectives, whereas someone like Todd Green is afforded individuality. So I'm not asked to condemn the January 6th attacks on the Capitol. I'm not asked to condemn Anders Breivik in Norway. I'm not asked to condemn Dylan Roof and Charleston. But if I were Muslim and my name were Muhammad, I would be asked to condemn Osama bin Laden and the Islamic State and go on, right? That's the racism at work here. And the racism is very much driving a lot of the counterterrorism paradigm, so that Muslim populations and Muslim organizations are deemed as primary obstacles to what I would call larger United States political and if dare I say, geopolitical ambitions about global dominance. Particularly since the end of the Cold War, that's been the case, and it got accelerated significantly after 9/11, the attack by Al Qaeda. But I don't, you know, I think it's difficult, and has always been difficult for the United States government to look at white individuals or white organizations that are not Muslim, obviously, in most cases, and then look at them as threats in quite the same way. They're, in that case, looked at as aberrations, therefore not deserving of counterterrorism attention or the funding, right? If someone like Dylan Roof commits violence, he's just an aberration. He's not, he doesn't break the mold of the assumption that white people who are not Muslim, right, or have a Christian background generally are benevolent influences in the world. But with a Muslim background, that's not the assumption at all. So we got to really tackle the racism at work in the counterterrorism paradigm, and why Muslim populations have been targeted and what I call presumed guilty, right? They are already presumed guilty just by the fact that they're Muslim, and then must defend themselves and then condemn terrorism, maybe asked to condemn terrorism. Whereas again, someone like me, I have not once ever been asked to condemn any terrorist attack by someone who looks like me or who has my cultural, racial, or religious background. Never. It's just assumed. I would condemn that violence, but if I had a different skin color, different name, if I were presumed to be Muslim, that would be my life, particularly if I were a public figure.
Yeah. And even just a different name, as we've seen with the Colorado attack. Right. And so Muslims in America and around the world are very many different skin colors and different, of course, have different languages, etc., and represent diversity even within the United States. and yet, of course, are not afforded that type of lens. They're very often criminalized. And that type of, that disparity you speak of in terms of white privilege afforded to white nationalist terrorists is something that I break down in the book. Even if we look at the example of the Oklahoma City bombing perpetrated by Timothy McVeigh and his accomplice on April 19th, 1995, that was the deadliest terrorist attack perpetrated by an American citizen on American soil to date. And yet the initial media coverage of that was pointing to somebody of Middle Eastern descent, which is problematic, first of all, for its assumptions, but then also for conflating Middle East with Muslims, which is not necessarily true. And also discrediting the majority of Arab Americans specifically are actually of Christian background as well. So that's another oversight. But it is the history of America is very much predicated upon white supremacy, and that is something that I make clear that we need to learn about and re-examine and understand how the implications of that and how the current infrastructures of our many institutions are very much supported by the notion of white supremacy, and why that would feed into the essentially the looking the other way that has allowed white nationalist terrorism to flourish in this country and as well as in many others.
No, a very good point. And I can only add one thing, which is I think the United States, broadly speaking, in white populations in particular, have a lot of work to do in order to come to terms with the violent history of this nation. The United States didn't just sort of emerge out of some sort of peaceful vacuum from the genocide of indigenous populations to the Atlantic slave trade and exploitation of Black bodies, to Jim Crow, right, to, frankly, to atomic annihilation at the end of the Second World War. The United States has a long history of some pretty brutal violence, extraordinarily brutal violence, but it's not a history that gets confronted very often and commemorated. We know how to commemorate stuff like 9/11. We have a motto for it. We have bumper stickers, never forget, right? But where's the never forget bumper stickers for the 4,000 plus African Americans who were lynched? Yeah. That's not the kind of violence white Americans typically want to confront, and that our educational system is often equipped to help them to confront. Therefore, without that kind of soul searching in the white populations, broadly speaking, about quote unquote our own violent history, we already have a warped sense of who is prone to violence because we haven't confronted that history, right? We haven't commemorated it. We haven't been educated about it. We tend to redact or whitewash that history or try to wipe it from our collective memories. And that's why it makes this topic that you're dealing with so challenging for people, I imagine.
Yes, well, that's why it took 10 plus years to write, honestly, is to be able to grapple with these concepts that were very fluid at the time of my writing. And essentially the time period in which I wrote the book as well saw a lot of change in terms of not only how we come to understand race, which is a fallacy, but very much a term and concept that is exploited and wielded for political power and privilege and to oppress. But essentially I started writing the book and researching in 2009, and that was the same year that the Department of Homeland Security essentially shut down the unit that was in charge of examining and analyzing and researching what was called right-wing extremism at the time. And there was a report that came out that said, hey, wait a second, we actually need to take this seriously. But the analyst, Daryl Johnson, was rebuked and then had to essentially apologize because there were a population of veterans that was also seen as, well, they may be problematic in terms of being recruited specifically for their tactical know-how by white nationalists. And that's what we've seen on January 6th specifically, is there's a disproportionate number of law enforcement as well as military past and present who were called upon specifically because of their military and tactical training. And we've seen that time and time again. So the many dynamics that have led us to the current understanding or the current events of white nationalism are not necessarily, coming out of the blue. They're very much intertwined with not only the history of the United States, but also the histories and the current events in terms of how the federal government has chosen to not address this issue for decades. Law enforcement agencies specifically have been very well aware of white nationalism, and yet there's been a whole security paradigm centered upon innocent Muslim Americans. And so we have to ask why, which I have done in the book. So there's an answer in the book, but those disparities are essentially what led me to the comparison aspect.
Right, no, absolutely. Sara, I was wondering if you could delve in a little bit more to the this question of genocide, white genocide, that's kind of prominent among white nationalists. I mean, I just referenced a while ago genocide in American history that actually happened, which is the genocide of indigenous populations. But this has been inverted really with white nationalists and has gained some traction. And you analyze this theme in your study of white nationalists. Can you explain a little bit more about what drives this anxiety, real or perceived anxiety, I guess, among white nationalists, that they are being subject to some sort of cultural or racial extinction in the United States?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's such a great point. So there's a whole chapter devoted to this concept, and it's called white genocide for a reason, because in the United States and around the world, the idea that white people are targets of annihilation, either by a planned attack or essentially an overhaul, or due to the sheer rise in numbers of people of color, there is this sense that white identity and the cultural and numeric identities essentially of white people are at threat. And this has actually been around for a long time, decades if not centuries, and is the common theme of many manifestos. So in one of the last chapters of the book, I detail the idea, this idea of replacement theory that is very common throughout. And that's something that even Nazi Germany, for example, really propped up their propaganda and discourse. But in the most recent decades within the United States, the concept of white genocide has become a type of calling card, essentially, in order to justify violence. And so, for example, we have the terrorist attack in El Paso, Texas, and the person who perpetrated that attack wrote in his manifestos, essentially posted online before the attack, that calls upon this great replacement theory that alludes to white genocide. And even if we look to what is often considered the motto of white nationalists in the United States and around the world, the 14 words, that was penned in 1988 by David Lane, who was himself a very prominent white nationalist. He even founded his own religion, essentially, and proselytized that through prisons. The 14 words says, "We must secure the existence of our people and a future for white children." So there is this idea, this narrative of victimhood that views white people as attacking white identity and white people, and that white people need to be need to enact violence in order to preserve their cultural and or religious beliefs. And we can see that this concept of white genocide is not necessarily out of nowhere, but if we look demographically, the United States in particular is definitely and definitively changing. So there will be what is called a majority minority, even within the next generation in terms of adults. So while the violence is not justified, the actual reality of this threat as they perceive it is justified.
Okay, no, thank you. Why do you think, Sara, the United States lacks a federal criminal statute for domestic terrorism? And do you think there should be such a statute? What are some of the obstacles in enacting such a statute?
So there should not be currently, given the lack of cultural competency, as well as just honestly basic human rights, I think, afforded to many people in this country who are not white. And I don't want to label them as not white because that's simply centering white people. But, you know, we're talking about Black, Asian, Pacific Islander, Latinx, a whole host of people of different cultural backgrounds and skin colors. But there should really, we know through history, especially if we look specifically at the history of the civil rights and how civil rights leaders were monitored and surveilled by law enforcement agencies in the United States. We know that any type of the security paradigm in the United States was essentially founded in order to suppress political opposition to the current status quo, as well as suppress any type of political dissent. And that was very early on, for example, in the Hoover administration, who he had quite a long reign, and as well as during the civil rights era, and more recently, specifically, not only against Black Lives Matter advocates, but also Indigenous people and many other people and allies who are protesting Standing Rock, for example, or who protest certain immigration practices. Very often, these criminal statutes are weaponized against historically marginalized people rather than used to prosecute and seek justice for the acts of violence of white nationalists. So as history has taught us, any type of federal criminal statute will not be used for white nationalists specifically, but often used to further marginalize historically oppressed people through law. As well as there are also arguments that there are current laws in place that will be able to prosecute white nationalists effectively. There are a whole range of options currently being used, but again, as the recent tragedies in Atlanta specifically have shown, that there are often disagreements as to even what constitutes a hate crime. So it's with some disheartenment, I think, that I say that while we do have these laws available to us, they're very often not used for purposes of justice, essentially, against white nationalists.
Since you brought up hate crimes, just a quick follow-up. Do you also sense that there is a more that can be done at a national level to track hate crimes, better define hate crimes, having law enforcement agencies mandatorily report hate crimes, which is currently not the case, right?
Yeah.
Is that a promising route, or is that also one riddled with obstacles too?
Well, it's going to be riddled with obstacles, but I think any type of positive change for communities to uplift currently oppressed communities is going to have to be, going to be riddled with obstacles. But I think something like that with the federal tracking of hate crimes, which is unconscionable that it's not done currently, but it's something like that is, yes, it's going to have to be done. As well as there's a lot of secrecy, or there's a veil currently on white nationalist cases specifically as well too. So I think more transparency will always do right by democracy.
No, yeah, I agree with you. I think that one of the challenges with hate crimes too is just it would be training law enforcement agencies that even are willing to report them to better identify them. Again, white people are often given the benefit of the doubt. The law enforcement spokesperson for the Atlanta shootings, who infamously now said that, well, the guy was having a bad day, right? Well, I don't know. I think you can't quite you can't quite limit it to that, right? This guy was not just having a bad day. You had to dig a little bit deeper, but there was initially just kind of a lack of curiosity about what would have driven a person like this to not only murder all these women, but women of a common racial background and heritage, right? That's not a coincidence. Or I remember in 2015 the Chapel Hill murders with 3 young Muslim adults who were murdered, and again local police quickly concluded that, well, it was a parking dispute, right? Even though the 3 young Muslims were murdered in their apartments, execution style, right? That doesn't sound like a parking dispute, right? But again, the police officers in question just had very little curiosity about going further. And then years later, and actually quite recently in the grand scheme of things, kind of went back and I said, okay, you know what, we made a mistake there, right? But the lack of training on, even sort of pointing out what a hate crime could be, what would, this idea of implicit bias, or if not explicit bias that motivates people, those conversations are really lacking in a lot of law enforcement agencies, and a lot more work needs to be done there. But yeah, I'm with you. I hope that we can make some progress in that regard too.
And it's not only about the conversations, it's also about the worldviews of police departments, law enforcement, and the cultures around them that essentially denigrate fellow human beings as the other, or as subhuman, or as not worthy of the same types of investigations or treatment. And so I think and that's something I also address in the book, is that it's not really until we recognize each other as fellow human beings, and respect each other and recognize each other's rights as human beings, that many of these issues and complications that we face today, and the security challenges that we face today, are not going to be addressed, dismantled, and then met with justice until we do so.
All right, no, very good, very good. Let's see, do we have time for one more, David, before going in, or do you want to? Yeah. All right, we'll do one more, and then we'll turn things over to the audience in terms of driving the questions. At the very end of the book, you really get into a good bit of a discussion, Sara, about needing a new approach to counterterrorism, as the current one is bankrupt for a variety of reasons, and we've talked about all of that already. You refer to a promising new approach called the holistic justice approach. Can you say a little bit more about what you mean by holistic justice, and why you insist that a holistic justice approach must move beyond anti-racism to anti-oppression in order to counter the threats posed by white nationalists and the rampant Islamophobia of the current counterterrorism initiatives?
Yeah, thank you for that. So holistic justice is a term that I use in essentially addressing the complexity of white nationalism, as well as the complexity of the current counterterrorism paradigm, which is very much propped up by Islamophobia. So holistic justice is predicated upon 2 principles. One is empathy, and that is what we've discussed before. That is understanding the history of one's own community within the larger narrative of wherever one is. So if that's the United States, then that's the United States, or if that's a country in Northern Europe, then that's a country in Northern Europe. But it's very important to understand one's own placement. So if one is and also the histories of people who one doesn't necessarily identify with. And that is so important, because it's not until we understand our histories and our current placements and how our positionalities essentially shape our worldviews of ourselves and towards each other, that we will understand how white supremacy is essentially institutionalized through so many aspects of our day. And whether that's not necessarily just relegated to law enforcement, but that's through education, and that is through healthcare, and that is through environmental policy, for example, housing, etc. And so we need to understand, well, if I consider myself white, well, how is white supremacy essentially leveraged in order to afford me privilege? Or if there's somebody who's considered indigenous, how is white supremacy essentially exploited in order to oppress those communities? And so I call it the understandings of history, but empathy in terms of not necessarily not condoning or supporting anything, but in terms of really understanding the world through through the lens of people we don't necessarily identify with. And then the concept of anti-oppression, which you mentioned, moves from anti-racism to anti-oppression, is very much to address the full complexity of the challenges of white nationalism that we see. So we've been talking about Atlanta a lot, but what the Atlanta terrorist attacks point to is that it's not just about skin color identity, which is what race is essentially. It's also about gender identity, because there was definitely a component of misogyny. And very often in white nationalism, there's also anti-Semitism or Islamophobia, queerphobia, ableism, for example. So it's not just along lines of appearance, it's also along the lines of gender identity, sexual orientation, nationality, age, etc. There are a lot of different components that need to be factored in when we're seeking to understand white nationalism, and understanding it as in order to counter white nationalism as well as address the inequities within the current security paradigm. It's really going to be necessary as well as helpful to move from just looking at this as a problem of skin color to looking at this as an issue of many different types of oppression. So empathy will help us understand, and anti-oppression will help us create policies, and together is holistic justice. So essentially a comprehensive form of justice.
Thank you so much. And if you have any questions for Sara, please type them in the chat. We've already got a few really good ones. But Sara, right there, what you were talking about just now, holistic justice, that dovetailed with a question that I had actually earlier, which is how, besides considering how we or our recent ancestors, white people, have benefited from systemic racism, what are some other ways that we can sort of teach or confront the history of American racism and American racist violence, like to young kids?
Mm-hmm. Well, understand as well, I mean, what kind of media are they consuming? I mean, are they seeing themselves? Are they seeing as well as people who don't necessarily look like them in the media that they're consuming, in the books that they're reading, in the video games that they're playing? And also getting to know people who don't necessarily, again, look like them. So what are their friends like? What are their peers like? And I think that's really important, because these barriers to the white supremacy essentially will be dismantled when we also dismantle the barriers that lead us to thinking, well, that's another person, or that's the quote unquote the other. And I really think it's important, especially with children. There's such a wonderful opportunity for children to be able to grow up learning about different histories and different people, and not necessarily just through a white lens. So it's not, education isn't critical central component, but so too is socialization, getting to know people. Whether that, I mean, during the current time frame, it's not necessarily being able to meet other children on the playground or at school, but then also whether it's through video games or through books or other types of things, just have conversations about, there are a lot of really wonderful kids books specifically that address maybe what somebody you necessarily maybe haven't, or what they're not necessarily learning about in school, the challenges and life stories and accomplishments of different communities of color across the United States.
There really are some wonderful children's books that demonstrate diversity that we know. I've learned about so much in the last few years. Thanks, Sara. And this moves well into a comment from the audience that Beth had. She says, a Muslim friend in Middlebury told me back in 2001 that jihad was supposed to be more about the personal internal spiritual struggle and not Islam's struggle against non-believers. And I'm curious with both of you experts, what the case, how that means, but also when our children are confronted with stereotypes initially of other cultures, what does that feel like? What do we do then?
Mm-hmm. So there's a hadith actually, and that's a saying, action, or preference of the Prophet Muhammad, who is the last prophet, not the only prophet, but the last prophet in Islam. So Adam, the person who was created first, would be considered the first prophet. There's a hadith that states that jihad, the greatest jihad is of the self, but that is a weak hadith, from my understanding. But in terms of the way that jihad, the term itself, is meant to create a community of believers and then separate that from a community of people who are not Muslim. So that is very much dependent on the legitimacy of actually having an Islamic state that is recognized by the majority of Muslims. So there's a lot of theological, I wouldn't say complications, but there is no such thing, despite what Islamic State wants to call itself, there is no such recognition of any type of central authority afforded to any type of leader currently within the Islamic world. So that concept of jihad is not applicable to the present day. Because that's a political type of divide that is not necessarily seen as attacking non-Muslims. That is more to reinforce the political construct of an Islamic state that's recognized by the Muslim majority of the world. So I would say that there are many other types of concepts within Islam that actually call for the recognition of the commonality of all people, and even the verses of the Quran itself, which Muslims believe were revelations, the latest in the series of revelations. So the Bible is one revelation, Torah is another revelation, Gospels is another, Psalms is another, and then there are other revelations over time. But the final revelation of the Quran, as Muslims believe, also call for a recognition of the common humanity and recognition of actually the diversity of religions, in fact. So there's a lot of room within Islam to appreciate and respect diversity. And that's, I think, also one of the reasons why in the book I talk about the move away from jihad, because very often we essentialize Islam into jihad or brown people or beards or something, when in fact there are 2 billion people who call themselves Muslims, who not only look different from each other, but who have very often very different cultural practices from each other, even though they have the same essential beliefs. I don't know if, Todd, I want to give you some space to, if you want to reply to anything.
No, that was a great response. So yeah, I mean, I think as a religion scholar, I'm always encouraging my students, to remember that Islam doesn't believe anything. Christianity doesn't believe anything. Christianity and Islam are not people. Christians believe stuff. They believe a lot of things. So do Muslims, right? And so our job is always to look to, in this case, to Muslims as to what do they understand jihad to mean. And there are a variety of ways that the concept's been interpreted. I think the original question was referencing this hadith that Sarah did well to explain in terms of the outer and the inner jihad, right? This inner struggle, in some ways that some Muslims interpreted jihad in terms of that, but I think the fundamental question is always, how do Muslims themselves and close to 2 billion people in the world understand this concept? One thing to keep in mind, I'll finally say on this point, is the Islamic State or Al Qaeda has a certain extreme interpretation of jihad. What's fascinating that we should not forget is that people in the far right in Europe and the United States are invested in that same understanding of jihad, right? And we need to understand why that might be, and what benefit comes from interpreting the concept in that way, as opposed to the nuances that Sara has been pointing out both in her book and in her talk today.
And actually, just to tag on to that point as an addendum, that weaponization of both a very specific understanding of jihad, but also the weaponization of Islamophobia, which is anti-Muslim and anti-Islamic rhetoric, is weaponized by militant Islamists in order to perpetuate their own agenda, but also weaponized by white nationalists in order to support their own call for a white ethno-state, which these concepts I do discuss in the book. But Daphne, you had a last point about diversity in children. You had a second question.
Oh, it's not important. I was just trying to wed them together there. There's more chat questions in the chat. We don't need a question mine. Tara, I believe, rightly notes that I think I interrupted you when you were about to recommend a book. Was there a children's book about diversity, something like that you were going to recommend?
Oh yeah, sure. I have a whole list of them. The children's books on diversity. Is that what the questioner wants? Okay, so many. Okay, and let's see here. There's one that says, let's talk about race. It's just above me, so I can't pull that up here. And then there's there's a book called Skin Again. So let's talk about race, and then Skin Again. And then, oh gosh. Excuse me just a second. Let me grab this. There we go. Okay. So here we go. The Colors of Us. I feel like I'm reading Rainbow, which I wish, but anyway. So that's a good one. And then also Let's Talk About Race. And then as far as different communities, for example, and I find these good for adults too, honestly, just because of they're just fun to read and they're beautiful books. So Isaac is in the corner, and we have so many, but this one too, Power of Her Pen. And then there's just one more, which is, and this is quite a recently popular one. So it's, there you go. And I'm sure you could find all of those at Northshire Books.
I think so too. Thank you. There's a question here from Joe Cleveland. He says, how does letting go of a lone wolf or a bad apple explanation of terrorism, racism, nationalism, all of it, shift our understanding of accountability and responsibility in our attempts to dismantle both white supremacy or nationalism?
So how does erasing the lone wolf myth, how does that help us understand or dismantle white nationalism?
Right, yeah, how do we getting rid of that? How does that help us?
Mm-hmm. So, well, Todd, shall I take it?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, so there's a reason why I devote a whole chapter to this, because we, even currently, even a few months ago, the current Department of Homeland Security Secretary Mayorkas, he said something about lone wolves or something. And I really work to dismantle that, because it's not until we understand how white supremacy, but also the natural extension of white supremacy is going to be white nationalism. We can talk about that, I guess, in a little bit, but there is no such thing as a lone wolf. And the reason why I work so hard to dismantle that myth, particularly, of course, in the book, is that until we understand white nationalism as a system, as a worldview that engages with other like-minded people in order to proselytize and share propaganda, essentially, and also recruit, we will not be able to understand and actually come to terms with the full scope and reality of white nationalism. And post 9/11, I'm not sure how old the questioner is, but post 9/11, there was a lot of discourse and fear mongering over cells or lone wolves, etc. And there's still, I guess, somehow is that type of thinking. But really, if we understand if we work to break down the myth of the lone wolf, then we'll also understand how systems are at play, but also how organizational tactics and social media comes into play too. Because very often, the lone wolf myth will only cause us to devalue and essentially minimize the actual scope and threat of the problem, which I know that sounds perhaps counterintuitive given what we know of lone wolves, but really what the lone wolf myth has served to do is criminalize Muslim Americans. Again, if we look at the undercurrent of Islamophobia within the security agencies in this country, from the federal level to the local levels, and how Islamophobia has essentially been leveraged to construct and support these security agencies, that's what we see. We see is every Muslim is going to have this kernel of violence that only needs to be catalyzed by certain unknown factors, and every Muslim is inherently violent. Whereas the idea of a lone wolf is not necessarily applicable in our common national and international understanding to white nationalists. Now, that may change post January 6th, but I highly doubt it. Either way, I discuss in the book the parallels between the usage of lone wolves, but also how the mythology needs to be dismantled in order to grapple with the current organizations, and also, as I just mentioned, social media. And so social media is very much it offers a space, as we've seen with the planning, for example, of January 6th, for groups to get together and not only share common beliefs, but also share planning practices for perpetrating acts of terrorism, as we've seen on the attack at the US Capitol.
Well, I'm afraid we are out of time. This has been a fascinating discussion. Sara, Todd, thank you both so much. The book is Homegrown Hate: Why White Nationalists and Militant Islamists Are Waging War Against the United States. Thank you both so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you, everybody. I appreciate your questions and your comments. Thank you.
Have a good evening, everyone. Take care.
Take care, everyone. Thanks.